Hello and welcome. If you are watching this video, it means you must have purchased the gouache brushes from Digital Art Junkie. And if you did that, you are super awesome. And in this video, we're going to break down each one of those brushes as well as the paper textures. Please enjoy. To insert a paper texture, come up to your Actions panel and click Insert a File. Locate the correct folder and then choose a paper texture. You want to make sure it covers your entire canvas. Next, click the N beside the paper texture layer. Select Linear Burn, Color Burn, or Multiply. If you're doing this step after you have created a piece already, just choose whatever looks best. But if you have not started your piece yet, I always start with Linear Burn. All of your work is going to go in layers underneath that paper texture layer. So let's get into it. The solid liner is one of my most fundamental brushes. The solid texture and the stabilization makes it a great option for tracing outlines. You can use this brush to trace out major shapes in a piece and then create a clipping mask on top of it. In the clipping mask is where you can add all of your detail using the rest of the brushes from the pack. Our next brush is the flat opaque brush. There's a lot of opaque brushes in this pack. We have our first set right here, and the flat brush has a square tip to it. You can use this brush in quick or long strokes, but the more flourish or the more of a flick you have to your wrist at the end of the brush stroke, is the round opaque brush. The bristles keep in mind that all of the opaque brushes work very similarly. Just like the flat brush, adding a little flick to your wrist and lightening up pressure at the end of a brush stroke can give the effect of showing the bristles of a brush. It leaves the ends looking a little bit drier than the paint you put on previously. Next is the streaky opaque brush. This is a very pigmented brush. It works the same as the previous two opaque brushes, but this one gives the illusion that maybe you used a really old or dry brush with your gouache paints. So it has a very streaky, painterly effect. Next up are the creamy brushes. So the first one is the creamy flat brush. This brush acts like the stage that gouache gets into when you add a lot of water to it. So it's a very wet and diluted brush. Pressing down hard with your pencil is what will lay down the pigment. As you lighten up the pressure of your pencil, that's where it will start to become more diluted. The result is a very cloudy watercolor-like texture. Keep in mind that the creamy round brush works the exact same way, it just has a different brush tip. So next we have the sharp streaks brush. This brush is similar to the streaky opaque brush, but it's a lot more streaky. So it's as if you took the oldest dry bristled brush out of your art cabinet and used it to paint gouache. When you use this brush with light pressure, you'll see you just get a little bit of streaks as if you're just using the tip of the bristles. But when you press down hard, you get a much more pigmented and much more solid look. Next is the speckled and creamy brush. This is one of my favorites from the pack. The brush is pressure sensitive, so you'll get differences in your brush strokes by pressing down harder or lighter. But it has that really easy to blend wet feel that the other creamy brushes have. The difference is this brush has a much more speckled texture to it. You can see as I lighten up the pressure with my pencil here, I start to get more texture and a more translucent line. Gently running my brush very lightly along a brush stroke I've already laid down will actually pull color from the previous brush stroke. This makes blending with new colors really easy. The lighter you press down, the better blend you'll get. And the harder you press down, the more whatever color you're using will pop off the page. Next is a translucent flat brush. So this is a very see-through brush. You can run this brush over itself twice before it reaches its full potential in opacity. This makes it a great option for adding subtle changes in color and tone to a piece. Next we have the very wet flat brush. This is one of my favorite brushes. It's extremely diluted and it makes for really seamless, subtle blending. This brush is meant to be used with a light touch. You can add a bit more pigment by pressing down harder, but you'll get a softer blend by lightening up the pressure of your pencil. If you lay down a brush stroke, you can also blend that out even after you've lifted your pencil. Next we have the textured medium dry flat brush. By changing up the pressure of your pencil, you can give a really cool, kind of like streaked effect. I like to use this brush in short strokes with a flick of the wrist at the end of a brush stroke. Adding more pressure will decrease the amount of texture you can see, and it'll increase the amount of pigment laid down. Next is the textured round brush. I'm going to get rid of my paper texture so you guys can see this, but this brush has a watercolor paper texture. So even without a paper texture, you can still get a really handmade look to a piece by using this brush. It's a fairly translucent brush, so you're going to be able to see brush strokes underneath it. You'll see that the next brush, the textured liner, is very similar. Now the textured liner has a lot more pressure sensitivity, so pressing down harder with your pencil is going to increase the size of the line, and it's going to make it a little bit more translucent. Using light pressure with this pencil will result in a thin line that is very solid. Next up is the diluted messy edge brush. This is a very texturized brush that has a little bit of a wet feel to it, and it's also pretty translucent, so if you create a brush stroke and then make another one on top of it, you'll be able to see the brush strokes underneath. Now, the second diluted messy edge brush is a bit different in that this brush blends out a little bit better. So if you lighten up the pressure of your pencil, you can create a really soft blend. It kind of softens out the edges, adds a little bit of water, and dilutes the color. This brush is also pretty transparent, so you'll be able to see the brush strokes underneath. Now, the pure water brush is kind of not a brush at all. It's actually meant to blend colors together. So let's say I used an opaque brush and put down two colors next to each other. If I want to create a blend that looks like gouache, then I'll come down and select the pure water brush, and then I'll just run it lightly along these two colors. And the harder I press down, the more it's going to pull the other color. So press lightly to get a subtle blend and harder to get an aggressive one. Now the next few brushes are kind of like little cheat sheets. This leaves brush creates the look of hand-painted leaves without you actually having to draw them. So as I zoom in, you can see that texture there that looks hand-painted. And the lighter I press with my pencil, the more translucent these will be, and as I press down harder, they'll be a little bit more solid in color. Now the same general rules apply for the next couple brushes. This is the clouds brush. It works better on like a darker background using white, but to avoid a glare, I'm just going to use the blue one here. When I press down lightly, I get a really translucent bunch of clouds, and as I press down harder, it adds a lot more pigment. When I use this brush, I like to start off with a more transparent cloud and just lay down the general shape, and then I'll start adding depth in certain areas by pressing down harder. Now the bushes and leaves brush is pretty cool. This just creates like a little bunch of leaves that work really great for creating bushes, trees, things like that, just greenery. And I like to use this one the same way as the clouds, starting off with gradual translucent colors and then building up depth. And I also kind of like to stack colors on top of themselves. So for a bush, for instance, I'll start with a dark color, and then I will work my way up the color wheel and just start adding in lighter tones to create kind of a lighting effect and a more natural look. And then finally, we have the paint splatters brush. And this is just a great little accent brush for adding splatters at the end of a piece. You can either use it as a brush or you can just tap it and use it like a stamp. Thank you guys so much for watching, and more importantly, thank you so much for your order and your support. If you have any questions about anything at all, you can leave a comment, DM me, email me, whatever works, and I'll always be here to answer your questions.